The fog had settled thick and heavy over Blackthorn Cemetery, so dense that even the nearest headstones were nothing more than shadows. Maria, a night watchman for the graveyard, made her usual rounds, her flashlight cutting narrow beams through the gloom. She never liked this shift, but it was just a job. The cemetery was massive, dating back over 200 years, with crumbling tombstones, forgotten mausoleums, and wild, tangled grass. But tonight, something felt different. Her footsteps echoed in the stillness as she walked the narrow path, winding through the oldest section of the cemetery. The fog muffled everything around her, even the usual sound of leaves rustling or the distant hoot of owls. Silence wrapped itself around her like a second skin, oppressive and unnerving. She checked her watch. 2 hours until her shift ended. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered. "Not now," Maria muttered, shaking it. The beam steadied for a moment before dimming again. She cursed under her breath and kept walking, hoping it would hold out until she finished her rounds. As she passed an old crypt, she heard it, soft, barely audible at first, a whisper. She froze, her heart skipping a beat. She swept her flashlight toward the source of the sound, but there was nothing. Just the swirling fog dancing through the gravestones. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice sounding far too loud in the eerie quiet. No response. She listened again, straining her ears. The whisper came again, faint but distinct. It wasn't words, just a low, drawn-out breath. She felt a shiver crawl down her spine. Maybe it was the wind, but there was no wind tonight. Maria hesitated, considering heading back to her post at the cemetery gates. But something, a morbid curiosity perhaps, compelled her to keep going. She stepped off the path, following the direction of the sound, deeper into the fog-shrouded part of the cemetery, where the graves were older and less maintained. The whisper grew louder as she walked, coming from somewhere just ahead. She rounded a corner and her flashlight flickered again, casting long shadows across a row of ancient tombstones. Her breath caught in her throat when she saw it. A fresh grave. The earth was freshly disturbed, the dirt piled up next to the open pit, as though someone had recently dug it. But Maria knew that wasn't possible. There were no burials scheduled for weeks. Her pulse quickened as she approached, peering into the grave. The coffin was there, resting just a few feet below the surface. The wood was old and splintered, far too worn for a recent burial. Her mind raced. This doesn't make any sense. Then she heard the whisper again, louder this time, closer. "Maria!" She froze. It was her name, spoken in a low, raspy voice. She whipped around, shining her flashlight in every direction, but there was no one, just the fog and the silent gravestones. "Maria!" The voice came again, right behind her. Cold breath tickled the back of her neck. She spun around, her heart pounding, but the graveyard was empty. Her flashlight began to flicker more violently now, casting eerie flashes of light across the tombstones. And then she saw it, a figure, pale and gaunt, standing just beyond the edge of the fog. Its eyes were hollow, its mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. It wore what looked like a tattered burial shroud, the fabric frayed and filthy. But the worst part was its eyes. Empty black pits that seemed to suck the light from the air around them. Maria stumbled backward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure moved toward her, gliding silently over the ground, its whispers growing louder, more insistent. "Maria, you left me?" Her mind reeled. "Left you? I don't," she stammered, backing away from the figure. But it only came closer, its mouth still moving, the whisper now a cacophony of voices. Not just one, but many, all speaking her name. "You left me in the dark, alone." Her foot caught on the edge of the open grave, and she fell hard, her flashlight clattering out of her hand. The beam sputtered and died, plunging her into darkness. She scrabbled to her feet, desperate to escape, but the figure was already there, looming over her. In the dim light of the moon, Maria could see it more clearly now. It wasn't just one figure, it was many. Dozens of pale faces, twisted in pain, all emerging from the fog, their voices blending into a low, mournful wail. She screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the fog, muffled as though the cemetery itself was suffocating her. The figures closed in, their cold hands reaching for her, pulling her toward the open grave. "No!" she cried, kicking and struggling, but their grip was too strong. She felt herself being dragged, inch by inch, closer to the pit. The whispers became deafening, filling her mind with terror. "Come back! Stay with us!" Her body slipped over the edge of the grave, and she tumbled into the pit, landing hard against the coffin. The lid creaked open under her weight, revealing the decayed remains of a corpse inside. But as she stared in horror, the corpse's eyes snapped open. "Maria," it whispered, its bony hand reaching out to her. The last thing she saw was the fog closing in, the figures surrounding the grave, their hollow eyes staring down at her. And then silence. The next morning, when the new shift arrived, they found the cemetery gate wide open, Maria's flashlight lying abandoned on the ground near a fresh grave. No one could explain how the grave had appeared, or why the name carved into the headstone was Maria's, and no one ever saw her again. But if you visit Blackthorn Cemetery on a foggy night, they say you can still hear the whispers, calling for her to return.